You're listening to episode 124 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. Ginger Campbell speaks with us about the science of the brain and about the unconscious origins of certainty. How often have we been absolutely certain of something? We remember it clearly. We know it in our gut. It's a sure thing. Only it's not a sure thing. We're fallible creatures as humans, and our evolutionary trajectory didn't make us perfect, it made us human. Part of being human is the possibility of being wrong about something. A mark of our maturity is the understanding, acceptance, and integration of that fact. When we build into our daily life responses to our environment that our brains are not tape recorders, that we sometimes decide on emotion rather than reason, and that our ideas about the world are not always an accurate reflection of the world, we're able to have more realistic, positive, and reasoned responses to others. Dr. Ginger Campbell is an experienced emergency physician with a long-standing interest in mind-body medicine, the brain, and consciousness. She is also interested in a wide variety of other topics, including the history of science and ideas, and began podcasting in 2006, and has discovered that it is a great way to share ideas with people from around the world. Her Brain Science podcast explores how recent scientific discoveries are unraveling age-old mysteries such as intelligence, emotions, personality, and memory. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice, downy white tea. And our guest today is Dr. Ginger Campbell. Ginger, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Ted. Thanks for having me.
I'm very glad to. I first encountered you at TAM, that's the Amazing Meeting, last year in 2011, and you were on a panel discussion with one of my favorite fellow podcasters, as are you, Dr. Stephen Novella, talking about many topics. And at that particular moment, you were chatting about placebo, because there was a somewhat dismissive comment that was stated on the panel, and you stepped forward to describe that, well, actually, there are things going on in the brain for these self-reporting I feel better kinds of situations. And the person who was sitting next to me in the audience said, "Oh, no, placebo is just nonsense." And happily, I had my iPad with me, and I had just done an interview with a neurologist about what those neurological events were. And I showed him, like, no, actually, biologically, there's something going on. This may not cure your cancer, and you're not going to be able to levitate, but there is something biological going on. And he just kind of dismissed it and ignored the evidence, which put him in the "you're not really a skeptic" bucket as far as I was concerned. So thank you for stepping up. I appreciate that, and I'm so glad that you're here with us today. And I also wanted to mention before I forget that you yourself are a podcaster of two very popular podcasts. One of them is Brain Science Podcast, and another is Books and Ideas podcasts. So, audience, be sure to check those out, and I will be linking them on the episode page for this episode. Ginger, if you would please tell us about your background, because you cover science and medicine and brain stuff, and you're also an active meditator. So tell us how all that came about.
Okay, well, I was a Boeing brat. My dad worked for Boeing during the space program, so I ended up growing up in Alabama because that's where Wernher von Braun was. And so I started out as an engineer. Met my husband during college, and he was the one who introduced me to Buddhism because he had had some experience at a local Zen center, and this was in the 70s. And I wasn't really I read Alan Watts but Zen didn't really resonate for me because of the insistence that you sit in an extremely, for me, impossible position. Because I have had some congenital hip problems and I just literally can't sit cross-legged. So I was just totally turned off by that. In fact, when my husband and I met, I was actually a Jehovah's Witness, which I guess is about as far from a skeptic as you can get. But thanks to my husband, I started exploring the science behind evolution, which led to me getting out of Jehovah's Witnesses around 1979. Began a long journey of searching that took me through many things. Didn't get to Buddhism directly. I went through, I was very interested in Native American spirituality. I also decided to go to medical school, so that took up some time.
Just a little bit, yeah.
And so when I was doing medical school, I wasn't really worrying about anything spiritual, to be honest. I was worrying about surviving. But then after I had my first hip replacement in 1987, it was a setback because I was really into sports and I had to find a new focus for my life. That was when I really got into Native American spirituality. I did several vision quests, and eventually I think I found my way back to Buddhism, partly because I suddenly discovered, I'd been reading the stuff, but I realized, hey, actually Buddhism's kind of neat because it doesn't have any gods in it. And I discovered the Vipassana tradition and the insight meditation method, which does not require that you sit with your legs crossed. So I actually did start a mindfulness practice, and I was pretty regular for about 3 years. And to be honest with you, what happened? In 2001, I went to a silent retreat at Spirit Rock. Do you know Spirit Rock?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And unfortunately, at the time, I didn't realize that I had a stress fracture in my hip. And these retreats involve, a lot of sitting, a lot of walking meditation. And I was just so miserable. But on the walking meditation, it took me 5 days to figure out, hey, I could not do this. And I also had one meditation experience that was where I felt very anxious and uncomfortable. And the teacher didn't really help me to deal with that very well. Plus, I'd only been meditating about 20 minutes a day. So it was something of an overdose for me. And my practice, I have to say, has been pretty sparse since then, but it hasn't changed the fact that I am interested in the mind. And so what happened was I came back, and I was actually also interested in yoga at the time. I had to have another hip replacement because of the stress fracture. And while I was laid up, I was reading about the spiritual teachings behind yoga. And I became very disillusioned because all of the traditional Eastern approaches have so much emphasis on what someone said 2,000 years ago, like it was like the ultimate wisdom. And I was like, there needs to be a way to incorporate new stuff. And I started, for the first time in my life, reading Western philosophy. I had been reading Eastern philosophy for years. In fact, I have to say that one of my favorite books on Buddhism has always been Buddhism Without Belief. But anyhow, I started reading Western philosophy. And then I discovered that there's a whole piece of Western philosophy called philosophy of mind. And that's actually what led me back toward neuroscience, which I hadn't looked at since before medical school. And and I got really interested in that. And then through chance, I had an opportunity to do a book review for someone else's podcast. I had been wanting to do a podcast, but hadn't really come up with an idea. And this is in 2006, and I did my first little book review, and I just got such a rush from doing that I was like, yeah, I really do want to do podcasting. And I realized if I did neuroscience, which is what the Brain Science podcast focuses on, I would never run out of material.
Right.
So I've been doing that show now for 5.5 years, and I've only done 85 episodes, but considering that the kind of content that I put out, that's actually pretty. I mean, I'm still getting, as I'm sure you are, downloads of episode 1. So I'm proud that the content has been evergreen, which that was always my goal. And so I guess around the time I decided to start, well, before I started the Brain Science podcast, I discovered Skepticality because it was one of the very earliest podcasts you may remember. And that's what got me sort of involved in the skeptical community. I happen to live within a fairly easy drive, like 3 hours of Atlanta, so I was able to go to Dragon Con, which is where Derek and Swoopy of Skepticality, they live in Atlanta. So I got, in contact with them and the skeptical community in Atlanta, met DJ Grothy who at that time he was still at the Center for Inquiry, but that's kind of how I ended up getting involved in TAM.
And now head of the JREF. And
yeah.
In fact, I've probably seen you at Dragon Con because I go there every year as well, and I'm friends with Derek and Swoopy and that whole gang. So if you're going this year, let's make plans. I'll see you there.
Yeah, I didn't go last year, and it's kind of gotten off of my loop. You only have so many things you can budget into your thing. But yeah, it was really a great way to meet a lot of, and at the beginning, before the skeptic track got to be so big, it was a smaller community.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I guess the only thing I can say is that discovering your podcast has really been a big deal to me because I realized I was turned off by sort of the non-secular Buddhism. So I'm really excited to know that somebody's trying to invent secular Buddhism. I might like to become a part of it.
That's wonderful. We'd love to have you because there is a lot of crossover in, for example, some of the people that you've interviewed. Your episode 44 is an interview with Dr. Dan Siegel on his book, The Mindful Brain. We've also had him on this podcast. And just looking at the history and the trajectory of the wonderful scientists that you have had on your podcast, really you're looking at those underlying mechanisms that make us function. And one of your areas of interest is this idea of consciousness and what we mean by that. And I'm actually going to set that aside as an entirely different episode. I want to have you back on because I have a host of questions, and we'll include Dana Nuri in those conversations because I know she wants to talk with you directly about that. But let's talk a bit now about this intersection that you have with your own medical practice, with skepticism, your interest in meditation and neurology. That has led to some interesting developments for you to produce. And one of the things that I wanted us to chat about is a new offering that you have called Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. And I think there are very good ties to our meditation practice there. And I've started reading it myself, and it's beautifully done. So, Ginger, tell us more about this and what it's a part of and some of the main points about it.
Okay, well, Are You Sure is my leap into e-publishing. as you know, podcasts are generally free. And so I've produced all this content and I haven't figured out a way to make any money. So I honestly would I've discovered I love interviewing people. And my dream job would be to be able to do that as a paying job. Are You Sure is my leap into e-publishing, and it's really based on 2 episodes of the Brain Science podcast that aired back in 2008. And I have to give credit to Dr. Robert Burton because it's really based on a book of his called on being on being certain, being sure you're right even when you're not. And originally I had devoted 2 episodes to his book because I thought the ideas were so important. And he graciously has allowed me to turn this into a book. I mean, it's totally with his blessings, and I very much appreciate that. The 2 key ideas, I mean, I think the title sort of speaks for itself, which is the basic idea that the feeling of certainty comes from the unconscious. Now, what I mean by that is it comes from a part of our brain that we do not have access to. I think this is very relevant to meditators because I'm not sure that the Buddhist tradition would really acknowledge that there are parts that we can never have access to. But I know that there's a lot of talk about, thoughts arising. And, we experience this when we meditate, especially when we're trying to concentrate on our breath and all these thoughts keep popping into our head. Some of them seem like really good ideas that we wish we would think of when we weren't meditating. And this is really what I'm talking about in this book, is that sometimes thoughts seem to come from nowhere. Well, they actually come from things that are going on in the parts of the brain that we don't have conscious access to. And Dr. Burton has a really, I think, productive way of looking at this. He says that we need to think of this as these thoughts as look at thoughts more like we look at sensations. And this, again, is the way that meditators do look at their thoughts, but the average person doesn't. So what is it about sensation that's relevant here? Well, take vision. What we see has been so processed by our brain by the time it gets to our conscious awareness that it's not really what's out in the world. And we know this. Most of us are able to accept that our vision has been processed, even starting at the level of the retina. Processing goes on. So, for example, optical illusions. You can't not see an optical illusion. Even if you know it's an optical illusion, you can't not see it because it's happening at a level of your brain that you have no access or control over. So this is the sense in which we're talking about the feeling of being certain. What is the feeling of being certain? Well, it's just an example of something that comes from the unconscious that we focus on here because people put so much stock in it. For example, there's been a lot of books written recently that are really, touting the power of intuition, and they books like Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, who make it seem almost magical that you make these split-second decisions. And one of the points that Burton makes in his book is, no.
You don't.
The fact that you're really sure that you are right is not reliable. In fact, Elizabeth Lofton, I think you've interviewed her.
I have, yes.
She's done work that shows this, that the more confident the person is, and in her case, she's studying their confidence in whether their memories are accurate, and a lot of times there's an emotional content to that makes them feel really sure about it. But she's shown in her work that there is no relationship between how certain the person is that their memory is accurate and its actual accuracy.
Yeah, and cognitive dissonance, because we also had Carol Tavris.
Yeah, she's great.
That's exactly it, is that you get more entrenched in this feeling of certainty even when faced with facts that demonstrate that that is not necessarily the case. And I'm glad you brought up the example of optical illusions. I know Richard Wiseman uses them a lot in his talks as demonstrative of how our brains work, that they are not necessarily accurately representing what our perceptions are and what reality is. And that I use that example sometimes with folks when we talk about Gautama. Is, well, he had a human brain. Are you saying that Gautama didn't see optical illusions the same way that we do? Did he not see that these lines don't actually look parallel, or that there's an extra color in the wheel or something like? Well, of course he would have. That's part of our neurological makeup, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not a bad thing. That's just part of who we are and what makes us up. It's how we function.
One of the points that Dr. Burton makes in his book that I think is really important is the implications of this for in terms of feeling certain, in terms of tolerance, because another thing that you do not consciously control is what you believe. I mean, some skeptics are guilty of thinking that this is something under conscious control, and that therefore someone who, for example, believes in God, they could just will themselves not to. Just like you can't will yourself to start believing in God again if you don't. And what the things that we believe strongly that we can't prove, not only are they not under our control, they're probably, influenced by a lot of factors that we don't necessarily control. And given that fact, we really need to be, and this is something I've noticed that you emphasize on your podcast often, about the importance of tolerance to people who don't interpret the facts the same as we do. So that's one key idea. And the second one is, when something pops into your head, no matter how good it feels, you need to examine it and ask yourself, does it, stand up to scrutiny? There's no miraculous, there's no muse or something that gives you the great book idea that, or whatever. It's all coming from, inside your brain. I think the evidence for this is pretty convincing. and there's a lot of things that go into deciding, which message makes it to the top. And it doesn't necessarily, truth is not one of them. What works might be one of them, but truth, not so much. So when you wake up with a great idea, that's fine. But if that great idea is actually something really crazy and potentially dangerous, just because it just popped into your head doesn't mean you should, go off and do it. And this is entirely separate from the whole issue of the kinds of things we can do instantly because we're an expert at something, which we get into a little bit in the book, but I think that's beyond what we're talking about today. I mean, you can have an instant sense of something, depending on what your field of expertise is. You probably have things that you're an expert of that you have a feeling of knowing instantly. If I look at a patient and I say, oh, I think that patient, is sick or not, I still need to prove it. I mean, sometimes a person might not really look sick, but turn out to really be sick. So you have to, take even your own instincts and gut reactions with a certain amount of grain of salt.
I think that is one of the most important things as a message we try to convey, is that understanding that community, that are, whether we see them as, in the traditional sense, kalyanamitas or spiritual friends, or just the people we have that we check ourselves off because we know we have this idea in our forebrains that we could be wrong. We have that as part of our practice of questioning, and as we examine, say in meditation, what's going on in our minds, we can begin to tease out and maybe see a little more than we have in the past, these kinds of physical sensations and mental states which combine to form an emotion which has been maybe calling the shots more than we have been. And it's our ability to stretch out that moment, get a little more elbow room so that when we're not on the cushion, when we're not having that close examination as the thing we're doing as our primary activity, but we're at work or we're driving or we're doing something else, that we've at least got some practice in doing that. And the thing I like, Ginger, about your work and what you've been describing is that we still need to check because we don't always have a good perception. We may have something that seems very correct at the time. A post I just put on Facebook was to meditators, and it just takes the assumption that if you're a meditator, you know that more often your psychic powers are enhanced and you're able to predict and know when people are going to say something. And of course, this is nonsense. And if you put controls over that sort of situation, you realize that the effects disappear. That this is just us convincing ourselves that, I'm developing this ability with my No, you're not. You think you are. It's confirmation bias. It would be cool. I would love it if that were the case. But unfortunately, it hasn't withstood the scrutiny. If it does someday, that would be awesome. But I'm not going to hold my breath. So we do need to have some external validation for what we think is happening, because our perceptions can be wrong.
And it's really subtle and sneaky. Going back to when I spent my week at Spirit Rock, the biggest lesson I got from it was, during a silent meditation, you are not allowed to speak to anyone other than your teacher, and you even avoid eye contact. And what I noticed was that I was making up stories for every other person around me. There was this one guy in particular that I was fascinated by because he was wearing, the same black clothes every day, and he seemed to be eating different food than everybody else. And the food's pretty limited at a place like that. And I couldn't figure out what it was about the food he was eating. But I realized I was making up this whole story for him that, probably didn't. I never did actually talk to him, because during the meditation near the end, like the second to last day, they let us talk to the person next to us for like 30 minutes. And it was, it was amazing how much of an adrenaline that rush that was after being quiet for a week. But I didn't realize, and we do this all the time with the people around us. We make, assumptions about, things about what they're wearing, the car they drive, all kinds of, things that, and we tend to take that as if it was some kind of objective truth. We don't even realize that we're doing it.
Let's talk for a moment. There's some examples that you have in the book about that feeling of certainty. And what I'd like to do is maybe you could talk about an example from the book so people have an idea of that. Oh yeah, I've had that moment. I know what that feeling is. And then let's take that into, okay, so let's say there's something you're really convinced of with that sense that's not true. And use another example from the book on that. Maybe the Challenger study, for example, where
okay.
Hooks and looked at their own handwriting.
The simplest example is when you know that you think you know the answer to something, but you can't think of it. But you're really, really sure that you have the sense. When someone asks you something, you either feel like, I don't know the answer to that, or I know the answer to that. And that's the feeling I'm talking about. When you have the feeling that you know the answer, even if you can't think of it right that second. And Dr. Burton, in his interview, talked about the example of if you were going to visit someone that you hadn't visited in a long time, but you sort of remembered where they lived, and you just went down their street, and as soon as you saw the house and you were like, oh, that's it. And you think you knew it all along, but it was, sort of an interchange. Now, so that's just the sense of knowing. Now, the Challenger study is just a great example of something that, before I tell that, I'm going to ask everybody to remember, if you have a brother or a sister who's relatively close to you in age, Um, think about the last time you talked about, if I'm talking about adults, think about the last time you talked about when you were kids. I feel like my sister and I had like totally different childhoods. It's just really bizarre. But anyway, so the Challenger study basically, after the Challenger disaster, some psychologists, right after the Challenger disaster, some psychologists decided to interview, I think it was about 200 people, about what they were doing, how they felt, and they had them write it down. Then 2 years later, they talked to them again, and it was amazing because only about a quarter of them said the same thing that they had said 2 years before, and most of them there was at least some discrepancy. And the one that stands out for me was at least one person was shown their own handwriting, and he said, "Well, that's what I wrote, but that's not what happened."
Yeah, and you say in here right after that, you quote that sentence. Unless you think this was an isolated incident, there have been plenty of other documented cases. You can do it yourself, as Burton did when he asked several of his medical school classmates where they were on the day Kennedy was killed. And what fascinated me about the Challenger study, and for folks listening, I'll if it's online, I'll get a link to it, but it's essentially called Phantom Flashbulbs, False Recollections of Hearing the News About the Challenger. They wrote it down. It's in their own handwriting, and they were faced with it. And yet this sense of being right, this sense of certainty, was in conflict with the facts as they themselves had recorded them. And they were accepting their new model in their head over the evidence they themselves had created. So that's the kind of thing we're up against when we are in discussions with not just others, but even with ourselves, and questioning our own beliefs. That's how strong they are.
Well, and this gets into something that Carol may have talked about in her interview, which is memory is very dynamic. Of course, that's also what Elizabeth Loftus has shown. Memory is very dynamic. So every time we think about something that's happened to us in the past, we sort of relive it. That reliving has may be changed by what's happened to us since then, and so I'm sure that if somebody did the same study about 9/11, they would find the same thing. That people and the key thing, and this is something that I mentioned about Loftus's work, is that emotional feeling that is attached to an event like the Challenger or 9/11 or Kennedy's assassination is part of what makes it feel so true, is not reliable.
Yeah, it's not. we create false memories all the time. And for those who are listening to the podcast, do listen to the episode with Elizabeth Loftus, because we tie that into potential naturalistic explanations of past life memories, that these may not be valid representations of historical fact, but creations in our brain. Ginger, something I wanted us to chat about as well is, as I mentioned in the introduction, my first encounter with you was at TAM, and it was a discussion around placebos. I think you had recently spoken with a science writer for Times book division about placebos. Has that occurred yet?
Yes, I'm not sure exactly what form that'll appear in, because that's going to be. It wasn't clear to me what the actual title of the book he was working on is, or I would tell you.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell us about how that whole topic of placebos, and how, in at least what I observe in some areas of the skeptical community, we tend to use the word placebo in a very dismissive way and discount that there is a neurological component to the self-reporting, that granted it may not be knitting together damaged tissue. Absolutely, I'm with that. That's something in the real world that we can test. But when we're talking about, say, pain modulation, or how one generally feels, there may be more to it. So tell us about your understanding in your work with the placebo effect?
Well, I knew that I was going to be on that panel with Dr. Novella and Dr. Harriet Hall, and she had made me aware of the work of somebody named Fabrizio Benedetti, who is in Italy, and I think he's probably the world's leading researcher on placebo effects. And he's published 2 really good books, which I have subsequently read and interviewed him. So I talked to him on the Brain Science podcast. So I recommend that for anyone who wants to get into the details of this. But he has basically shown that there are multiple kinds of placebo effects. He uses the term to refer to the mental part of what happens when you get medical treatment, the psychological component. But one of the distinctions he makes is the way that the term placebo is used in clinical research is not the same as the way he's using it. And this is where a lot of the confusion comes in. When we do a study like the one that was brought up in TAM, a clinical study when we're trying to compare treatments, the purpose of the placebo, which is usually what people think of as placebo, it's nothing, a sugar pill or whatever. The purpose of the placebo in that context is to eliminate things like confirmation bias and regression to the mean, and the fact that the patient wants to get better to please the doctor, and that the doctor wants the medicine to work, and all these kinds of things, which are the reason why we have to have blinded studies. The placebo, its use is to help to control for that. So basically, you would expect that all those effects should be the same, more or less, in the person who's getting the active treatment and the person who's getting the placebo. So you expect that whatever effectiveness of the treatment that's above and beyond what you see in the placebo group is supposed to represent the actual active effectiveness of the treatment. Okay? So in that context, you think of placebo effects as all the stuff that's happening that's not attributed to the actual medicine. That's actually also got to include getting well on your own, which is what happens a lot in real life. Okay. In the research setting of trying to figure out what happens with what's happening, why do placebos work? It's more about the psychological component. Why is it that, for example, if you give somebody pain medicine, and it doesn't matter if it's a narcotic or a non-narcotic, if you give somebody pain medicine, it works better if they know they're getting it than if they don't. And that's, like double. Okay, that's real. That's in your brain real. And they've actually sorted out the neurological components of pain relief that are placebo. That implies that there's something that goes on that's not from the pain medicine. That's the kind of stuff that Dr. Benedetti is interested in, that I fear that the skeptical community wants to throw out and ignore, mainly because they're concerned about the alternative medicine people using placebo effects as if, homeopathy is the worst, because everything they ever study on homeopathy comes out to be the same as placebo. And ironically, the very first placebo ever tested, the very first use of placebo was back in the 1800s. It was to test a homeopathic treatment.
And please let it be known, this is one episode where I didn't have to bring up homeopathy as the example of something that doesn't actually work. So
yeah,
and doing that.
and I have to say that I spent some time, not very long, in a blended medical practice that involved using some alternative treatments. And one reason I got out of it was because there was no distinction in those. There's this, everything is okay, whether it has any science behind it or not. As regular physicians, if our treatments are shown to be only as effective as placebo, we're supposed to quit using them. Okay, but the homeopathic proponents, aren't willing to say, okay, it's been tested, we need to move on. And that's where the real problem is. But the skeptical community is so concerned about the alternative medicine people getting traction using the positive side of placebos that I think they tend to ignore the fact that there really is something going on. The last thing I'll say about that is that Dr. Benedetti's research has shown that it depends on what system you're looking at. That's why he says there's placebo effects. So, for example, there's not very much in the way of placebo effects in the respiratory system that can be detected. I bring this up because, in the TAM issue, they were talking about the asthma study and how it didn't have any effect on the actual air movement of the patient, even though they felt better. Okay. You remember Novella doing that slide? This is it, back and forth?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. So the respiratory system, and that's not surprising, given that there doesn't seem to be that much mental interaction between us and our respiratory system. Although there is some, but it's not. I mean, the fact that the people who got the homeopathic, I think it was homeopathic in that study, I don't really remember for sure, whatever the alternative thing was, that they felt better. Well, the truth of the matter is when I give somebody a breathing treatment in the ER when they're having a bad asthma attack or exacerbation of their emphysema, they commonly say that they feel better before there's any objective evidence that they do. I mean, the same thing happens with lots of things that doctors do with patients. And Dr. Benedetti's research actually seems to indicate that a lot of this has to do with reduction in anxiety. As soon as you feel that someone's taking care of you, you are less anxious. Pain is not as bad when you're anxious. Your subjective experience of all kinds of symptoms is not as bad when you're less anxious.
Yeah, and the anxiety component of our psychological makeup is something that we've seen many controlled studies around the effects of meditation on controlling anxiety. And I would like to see even more controls on these kinds of studies, because as it occurred in a recent scientific conference that I attended on them, even some of the folks there, like Richie Davidson, was saying, we need to be better about our controls. That a lot of the work that we've done is being dismissed because they're finding that we didn't control randomized aspects to it here, and here. We did for the initial groups and people coming in, and we put them into two groups, a regular group and a control group, but that was the end of our controls and our randomization. We need to do more than that. So I'm eager to see some more rigor around that kind of work. But as you're saying, the thing that piques my interest in many of us is, okay, so we see something going on, we see placebo effects. What is the mechanism? What is it about that attention, Ginger, that you're giving to the patient who's having a particularly bad episode with their breathing, that they feel better even before any physical effect is evident in any way? What is the mechanism for that? How does that work? What's your understanding of the latest findings?
Well, remember that medications like Valium work because we have receptors in our brain for endogenous compounds that are very similar. So just like we have what are known as endogenous opiates that help us to control pain, the most extreme example of this is, in a life-threatening situation. We also have these endogenous substances like Valium. So I think that what happens is that it triggers a release of our body's own anti-anxiety medicines, if you would.
Mm-hmm.
And there is evidence to support that in Dr. Benedetti's work.
Excellent. Well, I also wanted to talk, going back to the book, Are You Sure? This is the first that you're putting out, but you have more planned. Is that correct?
Well, I'm hoping that if this is, successful in the sense that it reaches people besides the people who already listen to my podcast, and, it looks like it will be worth doing. I have so much material, and as you probably already know, the podcasting audience still represents a very small percentage of people. For some reason, we just can't seem to get past this hump. We're we've been kind of stagnant in terms of who will listen to podcasts for several years. And I don't know the solution to that, but I have transcripts of every podcast I've ever done. So I've just got so much great material.
Yeah,
so,
you have over 2 million downloads of your brain science podcast. So
more than 3 million, actually. But
more than 3 million at this point. So I'm just hoping someday to get to that point. So and nonetheless, that's still a hump to getting this kind of thing socialized in the general public. And that's one of your other areas of interest is ways to share scientific discoveries with everyone, with the general public. And in 2008, you launched a group blog, sciencepodcasters.org. Tell us about that. Is that still around?
Yeah, the idea behind that was that if you're a small independent podcaster, usually it's very hard to, if you're doing science podcasts, because the time required to put out a science podcast is significant. So it's hard, although there are people that put out shows once a week, they're usually people that have some backing. It's hard to put out the material every day, like these, gossip blogs. So, and the way Google works, they're looking at your site to see if it's changing. So my idea was that if we pooled our efforts and a bunch of us would post at least excerpts of our show notes onto the single site, then maybe that site could get a little bit more traffic than we could on our own. And then the way that it works is if you have a science podcast and you post to the site, you link back to your own audio files. I don't host audio files. You link back to your own show notes. So the whole goal is to drive traffic back to the individual podcasters' sites. I don't think the traffic is quite what I had hoped for it to be, but I think that's probably my fault because doing 2 other shows on my own, I just haven't probably put enough time into it.
It's hard when you're just working on your daily responsibilities and just doing one podcast. I can't imagine trying to do 2 and then hosting a website to support.
Well, it's Mur Lafferty's fault. When I first started listening, Mur?
I do. Yeah, yes, actually, as one of my favorite authors. I think I can think of the character names, but not the book title. But yes, Mur Lafferty is another DragonCon signing.
And podcasting pioneer. And when I first started listening to shows, she was doing Geek Fu, Action Grip, and I Should Be Writing. I think now she just does I Should Be Writing. And since I'm not a fiction writer, I have to admit I don't listen to it regularly. But she was doing this show called Geek Fu, Action Grip, which, she did over 100 episodes of it, but which was kind of a personal, this is what I'm doing, some essays and whatever she wanted. So my original idea was, okay, I'm going to do the Brain Science podcast. It's going to be neuroscience and related, but that's not the only thing I'm interested in. So I want a place where I can, put other stuff. And the first 2 episodes were real personal, kind of Mur style, but I realized that didn't really work for me. So it sort of evolved into more of an interview show. And to be honest, I don't put it out as regularly as I used to. I used to put it out every month, but it's kind of, as I've been working on this book project, I haven't put out an episode, but I am going to put one out next month. I have Terrence Deacon, who wrote a really interesting book about emergence that I'm going to be interviewing him. I actually already have it. I just have to edit it. So it'll be for those of you few books and ideas fans out there, it is coming back.
It is, and the book I was thinking of by Mur is Playing for Keeps.
Yeah.
If you're a comic fan, get that one. I'll link to it on the episode page for this episode because that's a lot of fun, and I'll also be linking to Ginger's work and her sites as well. Let me read off a couple of addresses for you. For the Brain Science Podcast, it's www.brainsciencepodcast.com. The Books and Ideas Podcast is www.virginiacampbell, CampbellMD.com.
Mostly VirginiaCampbellMD.com is kind of my umbrella site. You can get to everything else from there. You can get to the podcast easily in iTunes. You just put in Ginger Campbell into the iTunes store. You won't have any problems finding both my podcast and their apps.
Mm-hmm. Nice that you got apps on the iTunes store. Cool.
Yeah, and Are You Sure will be an iBook eventually, but right now it's just in Kindle. But you can read Kindle books on iPad. So if I want to mention that if you for some reason don't have a way to read a Kindle book, all you have to do is send me your Amazon receipt and I'll send you the PDF. The reason I'm not selling the PDF is because there's no way to get any kind of book, ratings on that, and I'm trying to get some Amazon ratings. I haven't had much success with that yet. But anyway, I'm focused on Amazon, trying to get people to buy it there so that it can hopefully, get a little bit of traction on Amazon first.
Yeah. And there are free Kindle readers for PCs and certainly for the iPad. But if you do have any troubles getting that, let Ginger know. She'll get you a copy.
Oh, and it's only $2.99 because it's a short. It's what in ebooks would be, what in Kindle would call a Kindle short.
Yep.
So if you're like, I don't have time to read a whole book, it's less than 50, it's actually less than 50 pages long.
Yeah, it's 46 pages of really good material, though. If you are someone who is always interested in hearing on how the mind works, if those are the episodes of this podcast that really pique your interest, this is something for you to get, because I do have it. I've gotten about halfway through it, and I've just enjoyed every page because it's all the kinds of things that pique my interest in how the mind works and why I got into meditation in the first place. So, Ginger Campbell, thank you very much for being here. I want to have you back. This is your official invitation to come back to talk with us about other fun things like our sense of self and consciousness. So I hope you'll be back with us soon.
I hope so too. Thanks again, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.